All right. So why is there a need for the governance of land tenure of land, fisheries, and forests?
Well, why is there a need for the governance of land tenure and fisheries and forests? I think that the question of governance of tenure is one that is particularly important when you're looking at global development in its current state. We have just passed the 7 billion population figure for the world. I was in Sri Lanka last week, and that was celebrated at that point. But of course, it's not just population growth, with the expectation of 10 billion by the middle of this century. It's also population movements. The population is becoming increasingly urbanized. A few years ago, we turned into a predominantly urban global population, and that will be increasing. So much of the increase in the growth of the population will be based in the cities in future. We have economic growth, we have increasing demands and absolute requirements from the point of view of the environment in relation to climate change and other issues. All of these translate into demands on a finite natural resource base. So land, fisheries and forests are absolutely at the forefront of this. And if we can't improve the quality of governance, then we have a serious long-term and in many cases short-term problem on our hands. A particular feature of this is in relation to how poor governance translates into corruption, for example. We've done a lot of work with Transparency International trying to measure levels of corruption in relation to natural resources. And it's clearly one of the areas where there are greater opportunities for corruption than in many other areas. So it's in the top 3 of the main areas where corruption exists.
And what are the voluntary guidelines exactly?
The voluntary guidelines, FAO has a number of voluntary guidelines. We have about 6 of them, in fact, and the right to food is probably the most closely associated with the present voluntary guidelines that are being prepared in relation to governance of tenure. The guidelines provide a set of principles and of standards that countries, member countries, civil society and the private sector have agreed upon as the basis for formulating policies, for formulating legislation, and for improving the way in which they deal with a particular problem. In the question of the voluntary guidelines on the governance of tenure, this relates very much to who has access to land, how they have access to land, and how those rights are administered. So, and in different circumstances, how they're administered. So the guidelines fundamentally are about providing principles and guidance to countries in this critical area.
And how are the guidelines established? What's the development process?
Well, they've been in the process of being established for over a number of years. And I think it's important to mention that FAO has quite a wide partnership in relation to this. So we're working very closely with other UN agencies, including Habitat, including UNHCHR for human rights, and others, with the international financial institutions, with IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, and with the World Bank and others, and of course with civil society and with the private sector. So we have had a lengthy process of both expert preparation and consultations throughout the world. We've had 10 regional consultations with a broad range of stakeholders from governments, from civil society, from the private sector, from academia. And we've had 4 regional consultations specifically for civil society, and another one for the private sector. So in total, we've had considerably in excess of 1,000 people involved in the consultation side of the process. And that prepared a 0 draft, which was then subjected to a global e-consultation to produce a first draft. And the first draft is very much the basis for the negotiations that are ongoing at present. So following the completion of the first draft, that was handed over to an open-ended working group of the Committee on World Food Security, which is based at the moment here in FAO. And the open-ended working group has been dealing with the negotiations between all of the member countries, the civil society stakeholders and the private sector stakeholders, to provide the result that they are looking for, an agreed result, a consensus result.
And who are targeted by the voluntary guidelines?
Well, the voluntary guidelines actually are a global agreement. So to say that they're targeted at a particular group or whatever is perhaps not the way in which I would look at it. I think when we're looking at the targeting of the guidelines, of course, many countries will produce or get different things out of it. But I think we see them, well, firstly, we see that there is a lot of demand for them. That's been expressed throughout the consultations, and it's also been expressed strongly by countries in the negotiations. There's been a uniform feeling that the time is right and that there are important needs to address governance of tenure. So that's clearly there. But what will the countries and others get out of them? Well, I think that countries will find that a statement of principles is a very useful basis for discussion about how to move forward in their own policy development. In several of the consultations, we had country representatives from countries who said, you know, country X, our country is going through the process of deciding on how to deal with the question of compensation when land is taken by the state, or how to deal with introducing IT into land administration to make it more transparent. How can we do this? And so the guidelines address general principles about how to address this.
And how could the voluntary guidelines be implemented and used?
Well, I think that follows on from the question about who or why will they be useful? How will they be implemented and used? Well, we anticipate that a wide range of stakeholders and interested groups will be addressing the implementation, and that's one of the reasons why the partnership for developing the guidelines is so broad, because it's not just a question of states, it's also a question of civil society that will want to have principles that they can address with governments. It's private sector that will also want to have principles that they can address with governments. So it's a question of, in terms of implementation and use, it's a question of, I think, from a practical point of view, trying to develop as many partnerships around this agreed structure and agreed set of principles. But it's also a question of using this as an initiative to try to help mobilize resources. And one of the funny things about land tenure and land access and access to any of the natural resources is, of course, that it's a matter that deeply concerns individuals, it deeply concerns communities, it deeply concerns societies and economies, because land and natural resources are at the heart of all of those. When you start to look at making changes in those areas, it's very important to ensure that you have a basis for doing that. And some sort of set of principles and consensus is very important for that. But also translating that into reality requires often significant resources. And so we think that helping governments to try to have partnerships with entities that can mobilize those resources, or indeed to persuade governments to allocate resources themselves for implementation is important. And the guidelines will have an important role in that context too.
Could you elaborate on the importance of the voluntary guidelines?
Well, I think the importance of the voluntary guidelines really stems from a number of things. But I mentioned a moment ago that the question of tenure and of access to land and forestries and fisheries for the respective stakeholder groups is at the heart of what makes us what we are, in a sense. And it doesn't matter whether you're an individual, and it's some form of individual right of access. It's where you live. It's part of your identity. It's part of what you are. Or communities. In many countries, community tenure and access is the norm rather than individual. And individual access may be exercised within some form of community access rights. And indeed for societies as a whole. So the whole question of how tenure and access rights are dealt with is critical for all of us. And I think that's really why they're so important.
Fantastic. And the last question. What are the main achievements of the ongoing development negotiation process?
Well, the development process that's going on is now, we hope, in the final stages of the negotiation process. I think that the main achievements that we've had so far have been a remarkable consistency and ability to come to agreement across some of the most potentially contentious areas. And I think that it's been very interesting to find that there have been many shared positions between governments, civil society and private sector. There is far less polarization than one might have expected perhaps even 10 years ago. In fact, I think one of the great achievements of the process to date is, in fact, even bringing this to the table, bringing this to the global arena, where it's being properly debated in a balanced way, and where we're looking at the prospect within a matter of a few months of achieving a consensus document that will provide real guidance for all of the stakeholders about the future and how we should deal with governance of tenure. So I think that that's a really historic and groundbreaking, spectacular achievement.